Hello and a warm welcome to the CNBC Africa special, where the South African Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan will be delivering his midterm budget policy review speech today. Now, clearly he does face a tough balancing act today as he announces the midterm budget that can boost the ailing economy while showing his fraud case is not distracting him. We will be discussing some of the issues as well as the precarious position that the finance minister is in with our panel of experts who are joining us just before the 2 o'clock start to the speech that will take place by the minister later today. Joining us in studio here at the JSC, we have Rossouw, who's the head of economics and business sciences at Wits University. Nhamo, Director at Global Financial Innovation. Also with us is Muzi, Mathema, who is from KPMG, and Muneer, Hassan, Senior Lecturer in Taxation at the University of Johannesburg. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. I think quite an interesting conversation that will be taking place over the next 30 minutes, given that fast track to about a year ago, fees must fall was still quite prominent. We had a different finance minister in his position. And again, some of the themes were quite similar. Fiscal consolidation, looking for economic growth. But goodness, Pravin certainly has a tight rope to walk. Muneer, let's start off with you and your thoughts on some of the challenges that the minister certainly faces today.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a quite balancing act, that he's going to have to put forward this afternoon. I think from a tax point of view, he did allude to last year in his speech that we're looking for another plus minus 15 billion. So where is that going to come from? We got issues on the table like sugar tax, carbon taxes, which are still being debated. And clearly we look in this medium-term budget for some kind of signals as to where we're going to move forward on those kind of policy issues.
I want to stick with you on that tax issue, sugar tax. I'm not so keen because I am quite a cool drink fan myself. But on that element, I've heard that the global theme is that the SDG goals, as many other institutions, have actually pushed forward quite actively. So does it mean in South Africa that despite the pushback we've seen from some of the FMCG companies, that this might really go ahead?
I think if we look internationally, we've seen some countries implement it and actually backtrack. And then there have been other international countries like Mexico where it has been quite successful. So the international balance gives it gives two sides of the story. We then also seen that immediately after we announced the implementation or the possible implementation, the UK also followed suit as well. I think there's two issues when we look at sugar tax. So one is, are we going to just implement it to fill that 15 billion that we're looking for shortfall, or is it really a change in policy behavior that we're trying to achieve on that point?
On that particular note, I also want to get perspective from you, Muzi, with regard to increasing the revenue pool and again taxation issues. Wealth tax also often comes up, and Muneer, feel free to jump in here, where that's also an option to be considered. But then again, the size of individuals who are actually form that super wealthy division are actually not enough. So not much money would actually be derived from taxing those individuals.
Yes, thank you for that. But first, let me add to what Muneer said. So what the minister said at the time of the February budget was that there will be an additional 15 billion this year and 43 billion raised in tax revenue over the MTBBS. So we are quite keen to see where that 43.1 billion will come from and whether the current tax buoyancy can sustain that level of growth rate, or whether the minister will allude to what revenue sources that tax billion will come from. And that links to my next point, which is the point on sugar tax. In as much as there's been a lot of international movement up and down around the sugar tax, a big concern there is the size of the sugar tax base and whether we'll be able to generate enough revenue to fill that 15 billion gap. And then moving to your point on wealth tax, I think that the risk with wealth tax is the fact that wealthy individuals are very liquid and it can lead to a lot of capital flight if we implement that tax. And also a worry that we cannot fully measure what the size of that tax base is, and I don't think the government and ourselves, certainly in the economic space, have a sense of how much revenue can be derived there. So I certainly don't think wealth tax will be on the cards.
What about the voluntary disclosure program? I do understand that that was something that was on the cards. Not too sure how much has been implemented on that front, but has it worked, Muneer?
Yeah, I think where we on that is that we've been announced, or we've been talking of a special dispensation there, so a special voluntary disclosure program. So that's going to kick in, and it should have kicked in from the 1st of October, and we're looking at 9 months. It should come to an end sort of June of next year. And the reasoning behind that as to why we've seen that is that sort of after June next year, we're going to see an international chain of information. And this is almost your last chance to come clean before SARS then comes and tells you what they know about you from from other sources.
Which is always the easier option, I understand.
Yeah.
Prof, let's bring you into the conversation to share your views here. We're talking tax,
wealth
but
taxes. I'm not in favor of wealth taxes for a number of reasons. One, you only tax certain types of wealth, mainly land and financial assets. Secondly, it's a completely new tax system that you have to derive. So rather than a wealth tax, I'm in favor of higher marginal tax rates on higher income earners. Currently, we reach our maximum marginal tax rate of 41% at 701,301 rands of taxable income. So I've worked out that if you introduce a new tax bracket of 45% on income earned above R1 million and a further new tax bracket of 50% on income earned above R1.5 million, incidentally you will raise 15 billion rands. So you're back at your 15 billion, which is suddenly becoming the magical figure. So I am in favor of such an approach rather than a wealth tax. It will also be an important indication to poor people that we care for them in a roundabout way by putting a higher tax on the more fortunate in the community.
Just to support what the professor is saying, I think we've already got two wealth taxes built into the income tax system. So we've got a form of donations tax, and then we've got estate duty, both being extremely complex in nature and difficult to administer as well. In fact, this donations tax is pure voluntary in the sense that you have to actually walk into SARS and go and disclose that you made a donation and then pay it over. I think I looked at the numbers. These two taxes collect or come in at less than 1% of the total tax collections.
Sure. Yeah. Muzi, you wanted to come in there?
Yes, just to add to what the Prof said, his proposal will actually make the tax system more progressive, and that will send a clearer message even to the poorer proportions of our economy that we are serious about redistribution. Yeah.
And I understand that's also quite a contentious issue. And Tim, feel free to come in here. I know you're not a tax expert, but we'll certainly take a look at the impact that this has on the wealthy, because you alluded to the tax on the wealthy, which again shows, as you've said, the lower income groups that you care for them. A contentious issue, especially given the fact that we're leading to the 2019 elections. But what does that mean about VAT, especially given the fact that we're not in line with international standards here? Muneer?
Oh, frankly, at the moment, it's from every perspective in South Africa, the wrong moment to increase VAT. The country is in a very, very difficult social space. And to tell people we are going to raise VAT, although the research has shown that VAT is slightly progressive rather than regressive, it will not be seen as that, it will not be viewed in that sense, and it will be seen as a heavy blow to poor people.
Yes, so I think on the issue of VAT, I think what we've seen is that because the minister can't touch VAT because it's such a hot issue at the moment, I think we've seen other indirect taxes creeping into the system. So, for example, sugar tax, which is spoken about, that is in a sense consumption tax. So without really raising the VAT, we are introducing tire taxes, sugar taxes, and can you see where I'm going with this? So are we not actually touching VAT in a sense?
What about the conversation of a two-tier system on VAT where you tax luxury goods so much more further?
Overly complex. I think we've considered it, while I was still at SAICA, we've done some research on that, and it will just add so much complexity in terms of the burden from our side. Even from SARS' side to administer that becomes over-complex, very over-complex, and just to administer that kind of an issue, it's just too difficult.
Yes, and the OECD has already come and also raised the same issues that Muneer just raised on the administrative burden that comes with a dual tax system. Yeah, but also to raise an additional point on the issue of raising VAT, the professor highlighted that our social space is currently not conducive for that. At the same time, if you look at the amount of pressure that households are in, the weakness of household consumption, clearly the revenue yield of VAT at this point will be very, very weak as well. Yeah.
We've touched on the element of raising the revenue here, but again, expenditure and that balance is a critical element here for the minister to also address. And we saw Nhlanhla implementing these particular strategies. Unfortunately, didn't really become implemented. But your take on the view that the minister might put on the table, Tim?
Well, one of the ways to contribute towards solving the tax and revenue collection issue is to look at ways to grow the economy. I was quite interested to see, I'm not sure how accurate the number is, but if you compare our growth rate, apparently Zim is expected to grow at 1.8% this year and 4.8% next year.
Goodness.
So you know,
does
the
that mean we're all
veracity of the
moving this
numbers,
year?
the veracity of the numbers is something else. But the issue is we're in a very bad space in relation to growth. Apparently, corporates are sitting on something like $600 billion of cash, not doing very much into it. And I think a lot of that has got to do with things like our political uncertainty and not knowing, for example, what South Africa would necessarily look like 5 years going out. So things like that are also affecting the picture.
What's different about this year's midterm budget speech, as well as the strong element that we've seen from the private sector in support of the finance minister when it comes to the NPA summons that he received just a few weeks ago? Does this add a certain element of significant confidence, not only from the private sector, but does it hold any water, and is it too little too late?
Indeed, but what makes this a particularly important MTBPS compared to earlier ones is the threat, the danger, put in whatever word you want in the space of a credit risk downgrade in December. I want to raise two other things that I really would want the Minister to say this afternoon. One is there will be no new presidential jet. I want to hear those words. The state that this country is currently in, a presidential jet might be the straw that breaks the back of the camel. There will be a public outcry against the presidential jet. So I want the Minister to say those words. Then I also want to hear the words that the government will no longer buy imported vehicles. There's no reason why the South African government cannot only buy vehicles manufactured in South Africa. Politicians can be very comfortable in the back of a good quality Toyota or Mercedes C-Class or BMW 3 Series made in South Africa. There's no justification to buy politicians expensive imported vehicles. We build quality vehicles in South Africa. I want that announced.
I like the idea of the Toyota Corolla, though, better than the C-Class. But on that, Prof, isn't the concern here the pushback that the minister might receive? Because it's being displayed very evidently in the newspapers that there are strong divisions within the ruling party.
Indeed, but the minister must give strong leadership at this point in time. We are all looking for strong leadership.
Yeah, and I think thematically key to what Professor has said, overall, I would like to see the minister also put stringent conditions on state-owned entities and the guarantees that they have. He has already done that with SAA with the 5 billion guarantee which they applied for. He could put some very stringent conditions such as cutting out loss-making routes. All hiring at the CEO and COO level should be done in consultation with the Treasury. Any other guarantee that will be announced tonight, I would like to see the minister also put those type of stringent conditions to guarantee that the investment that the state makes in its quasi-fiscal institutions does lead to some level of industrialization and return on investment.
On that note, what do you make then of Eskom and the potential nuclear plant plans?
Oof, it's a tough one. Look, I'm not too sure where I stand with the Eskom issue, whether that investment will address the power challenges we have. So I'm not sure in terms of the return on investment that we'll spend on the nuclear, whether we will get the yield from the economic space that we will. Yeah.
From a reputation perspective, Tim, if he does mention any plans that go ahead with this nuclear project, if you were one of the ratings agencies, would you view this in a negative light?
I suppose quite possibly because of the cost of a nuclear build. However, at the same time, this morning I was looking at some statistics, and it's possible that the whole ratings downgrade issue has been overplayed. I mean, on the default swaps have already priced an increase in the risk of a South African default. And one of the things outside of Nenegate and all that was going on from sort of November last year through to about mid-February, a lot of the emerging market currencies did see a sell-off pretty much across the board, with the exception of the Brazilian real. So one of the things we have is the political situation doesn't really help. In terms of every time something comes out that the rand weakens, but at the same time the rand does seem to be very correlated to an overall play. So late last year, early this year, we were sort of bottom of the pile near the Russian ruble. And maybe we should have actually been sitting somewhere between Brazil and Turkey. And then there's also some other issues related to the Fed's expecting to have a rate increase at the end of the year. Early October, a paper came out saying that the ECB might consider tapering. And that's also another dynamic that might complicate things next year. So it's almost like South Africa lost out on a year where things could have been better off, but there were just these continuous political issues, kind of putting a negative bent on investor sentiment and so on.
Exactly. I want to raise one of the elements that you brought up just a moment ago when it came to growing that pie and economic growth and where we can find opportunities to spur economic growth. SMMEs have always been highlighted as one of the differentiating factors here, but it almost seems as though there's a significant disconnect between the Ministry of SMMEs, Economic Development and DTI, and very few goals and objectives have been achieved here. Are we expecting the Minister to actually allude to these SMMEs today? And if he does, what could he say that would be different?
SMMEs are really the area where we can create jobs in South Africa. We don't need a Minister of Small Enterprises. As it is, we don't need all these ministers somewhere in economic affairs. We need a smaller cabinet. However, all we need for small and medium enterprises, government departments must pay these companies at the end of the month on delivery of invoice. The biggest challenge a small business faces, cash flow. So government must support new, small and existing small businesses in easing their cash flow by paying the invoices. What happens in practice? We have all these ministers, everybody talks small business and we don't pay them. Government departments wait 6 months, 9 months to pay these businesses. That's not the way to move forward.
I can just add to what the professor, in addition to cash flows, I think regulation, simplicity of regulation for SSMEs is critical. I think particularly from, for example, the company's perspective, the tax issues as well, I think we can see a lot more easing in this space, going forward.
As well as the easing of bureaucratic red tape within the government space when interacting with SMMEs.
Indeed, we suffer bureaucratic oversupply in South Africa. What we need in South Africa is authority must listen to the people. That is really where we are at this point in our history with our government. Authority is disregarding the people. We need to change that around.
On the interaction with the people, though, which does seem to be quite limited, so often we do see government ministers emphasizing the fact that the NDP again plays a critical role in boosting up economic participation and economic growth. The 9-point plan is also something that's alluded to, but is the concern here that none of these elements are actually quite tangible? It almost sounds like it's rehearsed. And again, is the NDP still relevant? Because last time I checked that document, you need, what, 5% economic growth to actually meet some of those 2030 targets?
I think the NDP ship has sailed. I think we have been sitting at sub 2% growth since the Great Recession. So the 5% ship has sailed. We now need to reorganize ourselves within the current global growth context, weak global growth context, and make the right investment to generate the growth that we need.
If you were the minister, then where would you be investing?
Energy, education, and infrastructure. And I'll cut the wage bill, and I'll reduce government military spending.
But do you guys agree? Any elements you want to pick up on there? I think there are quite a few.
Education.
We are so much in agreement here. I have hoped for a very nice debate, but all we are doing here this afternoon is concurring with one another. Perhaps we should write next year's budget speech.
we should.
I agree with you, Prof, but you mentioned education, which is quite critical, and of course the fees must fall. Protests are still continuing. Last we checked in the headlines, there are a few protests that have been scheduled, including some representatives of union departments, education, Nhamo, as well as the academics union. So perhaps there might be some disruptions to the minister's speech today. But number one, can South Africa actually afford free education?
South Africa can only afford it if we reprioritize on other expenditure items. And I can bring you a long list. I've worked out that if we can reduce cabinet by 10, from 37 ministers to 27 ministers, we will already save 300 million rands. Now, I mean, 300 million rands to 40 billion is not that big, but it is somewhere to start. So just reduce cabinet to 27 rather than 37, and already you have 300 million rands.
Tim?
I also think what's missing in the educational debate is the type of education. For example, your science, technical, engineering and medical are quite important. But should you necessarily be getting free education to go through and do a BCom English? You know, so I think there's also this issue on focusing on, you know, what exactly is it, what type of education do we need to be relevant to the world sort of 5, 10, 20 years from now, rather than sort of focusing on a general, you know, fees must fall and free university education, and, you know, it becomes a bit of a laugh for 4 years. I mean, in Denmark they had free education, and you also got paid. So what ended up happening was there was no incentive to finish a degree in 4 years, and everyone used to, and there was a tendency for, you know, to sort of clown around and see if you could extend it to about 6, and then that was cut because of issues of funding everything, and then apparently the university students weren't too happy about it. But, you know, those are some of the negative aspects that you do get. If you say fees must fall and it must be free, but then there's no incentive to actually finish on time and things like that.
Yeah, if I can come in there, I think in as much as the issue of affordability is one thing, but we must ask ourselves is, can we afford not to invest in higher education inequality? And certainly Tim already touches on the fact that we need to start investing in the type of higher tertiary education that have higher growth yields. And to also to add what the Prof said, I also think there's a couple of fiscal permutations the minister can play around with. For example, if we slash our 450 billion wage bill by 5%, that's 20 billion that has been unleashed. So I think there's fiscal permutations within the realm of policy making that can be derived to make the right type of investment in higher tertiary inequality. Yeah.
You mentioned that, and earlier today we had a conversation with a representative of COSATU, and he alluded to the fact that tax increases or a lack of increase on the wage bill would also concern them significantly, but they do want free education. And that actually brings to mind, what does the ordinary working South African citizens' budget need to look like? Because they're faced with so many obligations, rising inflation, which is eating into the limited funds that they have, these tertiary education pressures where they're trying to allude to a betterment of their children's life and successes, but again, minimal savings, because as we know, we live on consumption in South Africa. Are there quick wins that we can achieve for the ordinary man and the woman in the street with minimal disruption with regard to pro-state action, as well as a pushback from the working class in South Africa?
There are no quick wins that will make everybody happy. You will make some of the people happy, you will make some of the people unhappy. At best you can hope to make more than 50% of the people happy. That's the best you can hope for.
Yeah. But you touched on the issue of savings. I'll be keen to hear if part of the pack of documents that the minister comes up with is if we have any impact assessment or tax or perspective on what the government's tax-free savings tool, which they announced a few years, has been, whether it has induced any sort of savings within the economy. Certainly those statistics are not available to any of us here in the economics domain, but I'd love to see if those documents that do come out today, they do talk about that. And at the same time, if the document on tax incentive employment that the Treasury came with a while back, I'm just keen to see what the impact of those policies has been. Yeah.
Muneer?
I think just on the possibility of free education, I think there's only two possibilities. One is that either we're going to see some kind of increase in taxes that's going to fund it. Alternatively, like the Prof said, we got to cut some kind of expenditure.
Cutting expenditure. Well, there's so much more for us to explore in this conversation with regard to what to expect from the Finance Minister in just a moment. We are going to take a brief break, and as soon as the Minister does make his way onto the podium, we'll bring you that speech live. But we will continue with this conversation very briefly as we return from this quick ad break right after this.